Gursahani is a physician and a consulting neurologist at the Hinduja Hospital based in Mumbai. He's interested in epilepsy and palliative care. He's also an advocate for advanced care planning, both for his fellow Indians and also people across the world. He's the founding member of ELICIT, ELICIT, which stands for End of Life Care in India Task Force. Dr. Roop had taken a session last year as well in Aarohan, and one of our participants who runs a Parkinson's group in Chennai, and his physiotherapist Janet is there on in part of this Aarohan group as well. They had actually invited him to do a session on advanced directives for their group as well, because they've got a lot of elderly people, suffering from Parkinson's. So yes, Dr. Roop is a great resource and a very, very great faculty, and just the way he talks about end of life care and advanced directives actually teaches you a lot, even teaches a lot of young people to think about it. So I think it would be very interesting. I just checking when he's joining. Also, I've already introduced you to the group. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're not going to waste any time because we want to hear from you. In the last 20 minutes, we'll open it for question and answers for the group.
Sure. Sorry again, but anyway, this is a presentation that I have done earlier for Pallium India, and I'd like to thank them for inviting me to speak again. But in case any of you has seen this particular speech of mine on YouTube or wherever, I've changed it a bit. I've tried to make it a little different for this group. Now, although this is about advanced care planning, it's also a little more than that. It's about death, dying, and unfortunately, it is about lessons that we in India are yet to learn from the rest of the world. So, remember that in many ways, not in many ways, but in at least some ways, at least in digital finance or in communications or even in medical technology, we are not really behind the world. At least in digital finance, we are actually ahead. But when you look at medical technology, we are, I would say that any latest treatment probably reaches India about a couple of years or max a few years after it is invented elsewhere. But we are 4 decades behind the world in how we manage death and dying. But I'm still optimistic about the future, and this talk is actually about what you and I can do to make this future happen. Now, when you look at death and dying, remember that you take it for granted that if you go for any kind of surgery or anything, the medical system makes you sign your consent. Remember that this is called informed consent. It was not something that doctors used to do from the time of Hippocrates. No, this is something that started only in the 1930s. And then some of you may be aware of history, and you may know that after the Second World War, after the Nazi trials in Nuremberg, one of the major parts of the trials were those of the doctors who took part in human experiments in the concentration camps. And you know what was their reason, what their defense was? They said that nobody told us that we couldn't do what we did. And they did some pretty unforgivable things to their patients. So at some point, it became obvious to the world and also to the medical system that the patient really is finally completely in charge. And we call that the end of medical paternalism. Medical paternalism is when the doctor says, I know best, I will tell you. And from the 80s and 90s, at least in the United States and then the rest of the world, patient autonomy legislation really began. And one of the reasons that the United States became the world's laboratory for this was because it became something that their judicial system in state after state and their politicians kind of did competitive. So they really advanced pretty ahead. India, unfortunately, was left far behind. Now, when you look at end of life care, and you will hear other parts of this as well, it has multiple strands. It has ethics and social attitudes. It has legislation and politics. It has healthcare systems and the economics of healthcare systems. But remember, it has complex medical decision making because you're looking at fairly complex problems towards the end of somebody's life. And above it all is individual human suffering. And there's a lot here that has to do about social attitudes, including amongst doctors. So you will see, I mean, if you look at this attitude here, this is a marriage that if you look at its equivalent in India, there are parts of India where a marriage like this would still end up getting one or both of them killed by a Khap Panchayat. Don't forget that. And so we need to understand that for a large part of our country, the way what is right and what is wrong is thought about is maybe a little different for those of us who are English speaking and well educated and so on. And that's been called moral foundations theory. So when you look at, say, somebody who has a fairly advanced education, you will see that for us, individual autonomy, which means equality, liberty, justice, the principles of our constitution, obviously are more important than community, family, and perhaps even religion. Whereas for most of our fellow Indians, these are all community, family, which means fraternity, duty, hierarchy, respect, reputation, so on, and divinity, which means sanctity versus sin, left versus right, purity versus pollution. All of these are as much or more important than individual autonomy. The thing is that in 1950, we wrote ourselves an ethics software manual, which is still working almost 70 years later. And it specifies liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship. Now, the thing is that this kind of liberty is probably not enough for this day and age. It was a political statement of liberty in 1950. And the personal autonomy of an Indian citizen before 2017 to 18 was actually pretty low. In fact, it was, I don't know if this translates well, it was one big anda, zero. And then the Supreme Court brought the liberty of the Constitution of India into the 21st century, into the personal space. That began with the privacy judgment of Puttaswamy. Then came the judgment that I'm going to speak about, that of health autonomy on the 9th March 2018, and then sexual choice, the September 18 judgment. And in this judgment that I'm going to speak about on the 9th of March 2018, this case is labeled Common Cause versus the Union of India. Following on from the privacy judgment, it recognized that privacy was an integral part of the right to life, said that the right to refuse medical treatment had its basis in the rights to autonomy, dignity, and privacy. So it gave us a constitutional basis for what I'm going to be speaking about. That is advanced medical directives and withdrawal of life sustaining treatment, should you choose to make that clear. So this is the judgment, and it's almost about 500 pages, more than 500, it's about 540 pages. Each of the various judges really delivered their own opinions. And, but till this, actually, and to some extent, even after this, there was a realization that all of us had, at least as doctors. Many doctors, I mean, outside lay people probably do not even think about it, but I realized as a doctor that as a citizen, I would have no control over my own last days. So it was only with this judgment that our constitution, our constitutional structure, recognized the fact that we as citizens have the right to control our own last days. So if you take that constitutionally it is now valid. Now let us move ahead. Think of the last journey of your life, or actually, what do you want your illness experience to be like? Because although all of us think that we are going to go to bed one night and wake up the next morning in heaven, uh, that's not the way it is going to happen. And for most of us, the biggest worry about death and dying is dying with pain and suffering. And Woody Allen said that I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens. If you ask people, if you do random surveys, 90% of us want to die at home in our own bed, but in reality, 70 to 80% actually die in hospital. And I'll show that to you. And if you want to prevent that from happening, then you need a specific document that's called a living will. For that, it is also important to understand how we die. Now, as I said earlier, if you ask anybody, most people, if they think about it, think that they're just going to die suddenly one night in their sleep and the next morning. That's it. But unfortunately, the way it works, God generally wants you to check out hell before you reach heaven, so that you don't keep calling up customer care in heaven about the service there. So you actually check out hell first. And remember, after the age of 50 years, less than 10% of people die suddenly. It takes a great deal of punya for God to admit you directly to heaven. Like our long-haired president, he died while he was giving a lecture. I mean, that is what he loved doing best. He had a heart attack at the age of 83, and in an hour he was gone. So as I said, it takes a lot of punya to get that. What about the rest of us? Well, for many of us, but not all, the end will be by a terminal illness. When I call it a terminal illness, I mean something like cancer. Now, in cancer, if you know that people get a lot of treatments like chemotherapy and so on, and they actually do fairly well. They maintain a fairly good level of function until the cancer goes out of control. Sometimes, of course, it doesn't respond at all. Once that happens, then the cancer grows inexorably. And as it does, doctors can actually literally give you how many weeks, months that person has left. So we call this the waterfall trajectory. Once it begins falling, it reaches ground. And this is common of people, if at all, in the 60s. It accounts for what, 20% of all deaths. And I'm sure you'll recognize this particular VIP, Manohar Parrikar, a former defense minister and chief minister of Goa, who died with pancreatic cancer. The next kind of death is people who reach their 70s with bad diabetes, blood pressure, whatever, and have either lung failure or kidney failure or heart failure. And in this is called a looping trajectory. They run to crisis, get into hospital, come out not as good, going downhill, coming into crisis, out, and so on, until finally they pass away during a crisis. So it's a looping trajectory. Now, who is the picture I have here? The common man. Why? No VIP, because VIPs get organ transplants. So the common man getting bad diabetes, BP, and so on, about 15% of us in the 70s will die with this. And then, if you have been very good, if you have worked carefully at safeguarding your health and so on, then you end up reaching the other side of the 70s in not very good shape. I mean, you may be, even if you're very healthy in your 80s, life does tend to have this likelihood of going on dwindling down. And we call this frailty, often with dementia, with loss of memory and so on. And this accounts for almost 50% of us. We call this the dwindling trajectory. And long before these people pass on, they will have, as Atal Bihari did, become actually homebound and so on. Remember that after Atal Bihari lost that election, we heard nothing more from him. He had a stroke, but after that, he went on through dementia and finally passed away almost when he passed away in 2018. So, for about 85 to 90% of us, death is predictable. And this is predictable some weeks or months before it occurs. And yet, there was this WhatsApp forward that I got. For those of you who don't uh, speak Hindi, life and death have become so expensive. You can't be born without a cesarean, and you cannot die without a ventilator. And then I saw this on my Twitter feed. This was almost about a year ago. I think this was something from 19. Yeah. It was forwarded multiple times. Somebody had put this photograph. My grandfather passed away today. Last night, all he wanted to do was have one last beer with his sons. I can't imagine any hospital in India permitting that, but more importantly, the fact that everybody was told, okay, that it's time now to gather around to celebrate somebody's life and to wish him goodbye. No, we don't do that in India. And because of this and other reasons, India is not a country to die. So in 2010 and 2015, the economists did, and you can, if anybody is interested, this is a very high quality, very accessible document which is available free on the net. It's called the Quality of Death Index, published by the Economist, and it did surveys. It looked at various aspects of how people die, and in both it turned out that India was not a country to die. In the previous one, India was at the bottom of 40 large countries. In 2015, we found lots of, I mean, at least about 13 countries that were worse than us. And I think it would make us very happy. Both China and Pakistan were below us. Now, there are three major problems that this survey identified, but I mean, anybody who's in this field in India knows this. The first problem is that we are not willing to talk about death. Why is it important? Because for many people, when death is approaching, last wishes are important. It's called something. It's something called a life review, which is an emotional settling of accounts. And without that, people are not at peace. Our laws do not permit patients and families to take control. Doctors especially are scared about making decisions to withdraw treatment that is futile. The legal system worries about doctors and families getting together and misusing any laws that they make. So the default option is to continue till the bitter end. You may think that this is because doctors and hospitals want to make money out of dying patients. No, it is because nobody wants to make a decision. And the default option is to let it go on. And then we have poor access to systems that control suffering at the end, especially morphine for physical pain and professionals who can address total pain. And when you come to Pallium India, you know that if at all this is an organization that is dedicated to correcting this for India and for Indians. And I salute them for what they do. But remember that people who do this are in short supply, very short supply in India. So we come back again to the last journey of your life. And if I ask you who has the information, who is planning, whose responsibility is it to plan? Think about it. I'll suggest some answers. Remember, if you look at the information, foreseeing and foretelling was always the doctor's responsibility. Except that, well, sometime in the middle of the last century, we started to become better and better at both diagnosis and at treatment. Remember that there were no ICUs before the 1960s. Antibiotics came in the 1950s. So a lot of treatments really started off after the 50s and 60s. And because we got better and better at treatment, really, we got better and better at diagnosis. The third part of the doctor's skill triad, that is prognosis, foreseeing and foretelling, that began to dwindle. It really began to dwindle to the point that if I look at our textbooks, we see that it's not got, it's no longer got the kind of importance it used to have. And patients obviously are more empowered. So they don't, it's not okay for a big doctor to come and say, okay, it's time for Mr. So-and-so to depart. That doesn't work. Patients and families want to be informed honestly, accurately, and optimistically. At least we have to keep hope alive. And this, for doctors who are not trained to communicate, can be quite difficult. So difficult that most doctors don't even try. Till we reach the stage that doctors are willing to tell and their patients are willing to hear. Because if you remember, if I showed you that moral foundations theory, too very often uh, in India we find that families don't want us to tell the patient. Usually patients want to know, but a small number of patients also don't want to know. And given that, doctors don't know how to tell this, so effectively nothing is good. So remember, the information is of the doctors, but their policy is don't ask and don't tell. So the ball literally is in your court as a patient. And this knowledge is crucial if you want to plan for a good death, because you have to know when death is coming and to understand what can be expected. First of all, to have the time to say goodbye and, if possible, control the timing, so that then you can leave when it is time to go and not have life prolonged pointlessly. It allows you control, dignity, privacy, especially choice and control over where death occurs and in whose presence. And this is done through what are called advanced directives, which ensure that one's wishes are respected. And with all of this, you need to have pain relief and other symptom control, including spiritual and emotional support and what is called hospice care. Now, as you can understand, when we switch gears from cure to care, when we switch gears to symptom control, you really want the patient to be partnering with you and for the patient to be aware of what is happening. So this comes back to who is planning your last journey. Is it you? Is it someone you trust? Because if it is a default mode where nobody is planning, I can promise you that gives the rise to the worst suffering, because there's nobody able or willing to make decisions. In most situations, if this is open, it's only if there is a sympathetic doctor that this gets minimized. So, for instance, if you have palliative care involved, suffering can be minimized. But if not, unfortunately, uh, literally whatever is to happen will happen, and technology goes on and on. Eventually, life is ground down between the irresistible force of modern technology and the immovable object of biology. What cannot change? Well, eventually technology has to give up. But in between is the patient and the family that gets ground down. Now, if you can speak coherently, then it is you who always decide, and your choices and decisions come first. And that you must never forget. The problem is, can you decide right till the end? No. Most people lose their decision making capacity. once the dying process begins. We call this active dying. I'm sure you'll hear about this. And this can happen hours to days, usually about 3 to 4, up to about 3 to 4 days before actual death. And once this starts, there is no way anybody can change it. In people who get cancer, this loss of decision-making capacity, which we call delirium, happens days to weeks before death. In people who have organ failure, the looping trajectory, whenever they go down, they lose it, and it can be days, weeks, months. But in dementia, in people who have loss of memory and that capacity, and remember that will affect anything between 40 to 50% of people in their 80s, well, they lose that capacity anywhere between 10 and 15 years before death. So does that mean that you will lose control in that? Well, no, not if you plan for it. And for planning for it, you need something called living wills, which are a part of a set of instruments that are called advanced medical directives. When I say instruments, I mean documents. And the whole process is called advanced care planning. Now, this actually begins, and we are circling back to the original concept that I told you about, and that is autonomy. That's something that has become more and more a bigger part of the ethics that control, that determine how doctors and physicians and the medical science as a whole behaves, which says that the patient has the right to determine his or her own future, to accept or decline any therapy, or at least to decide who decides for the patient. Now, is this absolute? Is this a Western concept? Or is this, in Asia, does it get replaced by relational autonomy, where the rest of the family also plays a role? And I would leave it for you to understand that this is something that things are changing about. Once upon a time, we had large joint families and we had people, uh, family members who would automatically take charge, but with smaller families, nuclear families, that's becoming more and more difficult. And I think, and even with the family that survives, it becomes very traumatic for the family to take these decisions. If, say, for instance, the elder in the family has never made this kind of thing clear. So, although we call this relational autonomy or swadharma, I think there is a fair amount of individual autonomy that is still required. So the first decision that you have to take is I decide versus I decide who decides. Because if you do neither, then you will get suffering by default. So if possible, you have to think of 3 people who can accept this decision making responsibility and are available. Put them in sequence. The first decision maker is the person who you want first to take this decision. And then second and third are, in a sense, substitutes, because this cannot be a committee. They obviously will talk to each other, but only one person will decide. This is because when you put this decision together, you must uh, remember that not everybody is right for this decision making. Some people will follow your decision to the T and literally follow the whatever you written and literally write you off if you said that. Some people will be very, very reluctant to either to make decisions or to let you go. And there'll be only some people who will hear you out, understand what you want, and be willing to apply their mind. So ideally, the first decision maker has to be somebody who hears you out and understands your wishes and values. And the second and the third, if you have all 3 in the same category, well and good. But usually, you need this to be something that will be done um, in sequence, and at any given point, it's only one person who will make this decision. Now, the next decision is the location of care. Remember that generally, as I said, most people don't like a hospital because if it is a hospital, it means acute care, which means the ICU. And an ICU is a bad place to die. No intensivist, meaning the people, doctors who run ICUs, would ever want to die in their own ICU. The lights on constantly, there's continuous noise, and there are strange masked people doing painful things to you. You don't want that. And why would you go to an ICU? You would go to an ICU only if you wanted life-saving treatments. And remember that you have the right to refuse any or all of them. Now, in many patients, they do save lives. But when somebody is dying, they only prolong the dying process. They include IV fluids and medications, including antibiotics, tube feeding, dialysis, the ventilator, even chemotherapy. But probably the one that is the most traumatic, and that is cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation is when somebody's heart suddenly stops. And if you've ever watched it on TV or maybe even in a hospital, you will realize that suddenly a whole team of doctors and nurses descend on the person who's down. The chest is thumped, shocks are given, and in somebody who's dying, it can be a very painful process. So, for instance, if it's an old person, you can actually have, for giving good heart massage, you actually have to break the ribs, literally. It's that strong that it has to be done. And obviously, it makes no sense if somebody is at the end of life. So, if you say not ICU, then some people would still accept being in a hospital, but with clear instructions that that person will not go to the ICU. But if the family cannot manage at home and you have no other facilities, then you might go to hospital to make sure that the last days are peaceful. Then, of course, you have extended care facilities, including hospices. Unfortunately, these are available only for cancer all through India. The only one that I've heard of, one of them was in Goa. It's not functioning now, but there is one more that has just been started off in Mumbai. But worldwide, when surveyed, the majority of people say, I want to pass away in my own bed. Well, is it possible to pass away comfortably at home? Yes, it is. If you remember, these two, George and Barbara Bush, died 2 years ago. Sorry, 3 years ago, sometime in 2018. April 2018 was when Barbara Bush passed away and George Bush passed away in November 2018. And if you look at the pictures of their last days, they literally are holding a darbar at home. The whole family is around them. They're smiling. Obviously, there must be pain, but it was managed. In India, too, actually, it is possible. And this is my colleague, Dr. Anil Paleri of Calicut. He's a palliative care physician. And I remember accompanying him on rounds. Because in Kerala, rural Kerala, palliative care at home is the norm. And it is supported by the community by local small donations. This is a chai shop and money is being collected for this work there. With support from voluntary bodies and the government. And I can tell you that people in rural Kerala, on the whole, die better than people in the big metros of the country. So if you want this to happen, then you need this kind of a document elsewhere. Now, this document is called a living will, and you will see this document on the Pallium India website, and you can download it. It specifies that you're an adult, and this has to become applicable when you can no longer take part in decision making regarding your medical treatment. Remember that if decisions are being made and people are talking, the doctor is talking to your family, that is not okay. If you are the patient, the doctor has to talk to you. The wishes that you would want to put down is that if you reach the stage of terminal illness or go into coma with no reasonable expectation of regaining consciousness, or if you have a disease from which you cannot be expected to recover with an acceptable quality of life, or if you reach something called a persistent vegetative state, then a panel of 3 doctors should confirm this, and the life-sustaining treatments that I have ticked, which I do not want, should either not be started or they should be removed. And if you have any other issues or wishes, you should write them down by hand here. Now, when you do this, to secure compliance with this declaration, you appoint surrogate decision makers. They are called the healthcare power of attorney. And you have confirmed that they accepted this responsibility, and you may then list these people with their names, phone numbers, and if this person, the first person, is not available, the next two persons may be approached in the same order. And this declaration will remain in force during the lifetime of the patient unless it is revoked. Now, the thing is that it can be revoked orally, and I'll state that again a little further. This document is available, as I said, on the Pallium India website, and once this document is made, it has to be signed by the person in the presence of two witnesses. In India, it also requires an appropriate authority. The appropriate authority is a judicial magistrate first class who has to countersign it. Now, that is an issue, and we will discuss that a little later. Now, remember that the living will finally is just a document and requires a process and a system to make it effective. And as I said, we readily import the latest medical technology, but this system has not been imported by us so far. And how does the system work in the advanced countries of the West? It's called advanced care planning. It's a process to guide decision making about your healthcare if and when you do not have the capacity to decide for yourself. As you will have understood by now, it has two main components. The first is the appointment of a proxy decision maker. That's called the power of attorney for healthcare. And that power of attorney gets the guidance in the form of the advanced directive, which actually says what type of life, what level of care, what you hope for in the face of illness, all put together as the living will. But it essentially begins as a conversation between you, your family, and or the power of attorney for healthcare, if that is different from your family, which is quite okay. You may not want to put this burden on your family. Ideally, your healthcare providers, which means your doctors, should be part of this discussion. And because this can often be a complex discussion, you also would ideally want to have counselors who understand this whole business and can guide you. All of this needs to be included in your medical record, and then you have to have a system that confirms that this will be acted upon. But essentially, it begins as a conversation. And I strongly recommend that you follow up with this, with what is called the conversation project. I seem to, I'm not sure, but I think there is some possibility that Pallium India might be working with them. But anyway, regardless of that, you can look up the conversation project. And this ACP will be used if and when you lack the capacity to be your own decision maker. So the living will provides guidance for your surrogate healthcare power of attorney and your healthcare providers or doctors. Because if there is no decision and or decision maker, then we have a problem. How do we handle that? Well, we actually have to go out and see who is the right person who can make this decision in the place of the patient. And unfortunately, you might think that this was a very basic thing that should have been sorted out. No. The first public document in India that actually lists the sequence of people who can make this decision came up middle of last year in the forms of a guidance document from AIIMS Delhi. Elsewhere in the world, this is legislated, this is law, that if the person cannot speak, then this is the sequence of people who will make the decision. So in India, you can understand how far back we are. And this kind of appointment of somebody to take charge is crucial, especially when somebody doesn't have much of a biologic family or somebody who's outside conventional family structures. So for LGBT individuals, being able to appoint a healthcare power of attorney is crucial. Now, when do you do all this discussion? Well, you should do it with any new diagnosis, any major diagnosis in your 60s, yes. Any major hospitalization in your 70s, and any change in care needs. When you start requiring somebody to help you at home, that is when this needs to be done. But actually speaking, anytime, because it always seems too soon until it is too late. If you look this up, you will actually see a nice rap song by this guy, Z Dog MD. So which actually means anytime. And if you change your mind somewhere along the way, remember that this whole document can be revoked instantly orally. To make it is does take a bit of effort, but to revoke it is actually pretty simple. To explain to you how this would work, remember that three famous people, two of whom I spoke about, passed away in 2018. I told you about how the Bushes died at home in Darbar. Atal Bihari died in the AIMS ICU. He was on life support till the very end. In fact, he was on very, very advanced life support, which you use for heart and lung transplant. It's called ECMO. Think of it. A poor old man at the end of life being tortured like that. I don't think that was right. So Barbara and George Bush could do this because they could take charge of their last days and their system worked for them. As I said, constitutionally, this has been now made valid, acceptable by the Supreme Court of India. The problem is that the Supreme Court did not want to tread on what Parliament should be doing. So they made this living will, they put down some conditions for making it legally valid and enforceable. They did not say that if you make a living will, the Chief Justice of India is going to come running after you. Nothing of the kind. They only said that if it has to be enforceable, it needs to be done by this procedure. And this procedure means that a judicial magistrate first class has to sign off it. It has to be preserved in the district court. But they also forgot to add, what if a doctor sees this, all this done and says, too bad, I'm not going to listen to it. Now, that is the reason why you need a law to be made by Parliament, where what happens if a doctor refuses to acknowledge the living will also is specified. So this, as you can understand, makes for a bit of an uncertain situation. You know what has to be done. Perhaps a lot of doctors also know what has to be done. But we are yet to get to the stage where it can be enforced. But the first and most important thing that you can do is actually to start talking. Start by speaking to those close to you. Choose your surrogates. Confirm that they accept the responsibility, understand your wishes, and will follow your wishes. Because your wishes will be broad. And the situations that may arise will need them to apply their discretion based on their knowledge of your wishes. Somebody who says, I will just sign, is not okay. Somebody who says, I will not let you go, is also not okay. Somebody who says, yes, I hear you, I understand you, I will do what you want me to do. And you may even go further and say, no, my healthcare power of attorney, the only discretion my healthcare power of attorney is to make sure that my wishes are enforced. They will not do any more thinking. So you can decide whether they can have any discretion or not. As I said, this has to be signed in front of two witnesses. And I would suggest that at this time, you try and get this in the presence of an attested by a JMFC. Now, in the rest of the world, it takes just one or two witnesses. The signature even doesn't require to be attested. If at all, a notary public is required. This is, in that sense, much simpler than a estate will, where you're signing a property, so you need it to be registered and so on. So what I do recommend is that you can try to get a JMFC to sign off, but if not, at least complete the rest of the process, the speaking, the choosing, the writing, the signing. And once you've done this, make multiple copies, see that everybody is informed. See that it goes into the medical records, that the surrogate that you appointed has it, that your doctor has it. And in the West, actually it is converted into brightly colored copies, and at least one copy is on the fridge door, on a fridge magnet. Because if somebody is found unconscious at home, that's where the people who break open the door are supposed to look first. So everybody who needs to know needs to be informed, and ideally you should take it along whenever you are admitted for any procedure. I would suggest taking it a step further and showing it to every doctor you consult. You will find out if the doctor is willing to accept it and support you. And the doctor will then have to find out their hospital's policy, so you'll know where to get admitted in an emergency. And obviously the doctor will know your wishes. But more importantly, I need your help to make doctors understand how important this is, really. As somebody has said, be the change you wish to see in this world. I'm going to stop at this point. My email ID is here, and I'm happy to take questions. I've actually finished a little ahead of schedule in spite of starting late. I'll hold this for a minute more, but you'll be able to get my email ID from, I'm sure Palaminda will also share this. Right. I'm going to stop sharing now and take questions. Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Roop. We'll share your email ID with the group. The participants can ask their questions, unmute themselves, or write in the chat box.
Right. So, hi, Smriti is also here.
Hello. Hi.
Can I? Yes, Mr. Moody.
In the first, at the outset, I just want to thank Dr. Roop Gursahani. I felt like you keep on talking and talking and talking about it, while most of the people shy away from listening and focusing and talking on depth. And last days, sincerely from the core of my heart, I did not even have my lunch. I said, let me listen to him first. That's the kind of connect that you made on depth. It says you die empty. But then one case that comes to my mind immediately is about this aged couple in Chembur. He's available on the website. It's available here on the website. And they appealed to the Supreme Court, namely the President of India, for mercy killing. They were aged 87 and 84 respectively, and they didn't have children, and he's working in a government office. And the old age was so painful for them. They didn't have any disease or terminal illness or sickness or any kind. Nobody was there to spend time talking to them. That was the only grievance that they had about life. And they wrote to President of India saying that we want to end our life. And it was not permitted. And they had not made anything like how you said about the living will was not made. I went and visited them some time ago in 2018. And they were so welcoming, you know, they're so welcoming. I told them about, you see, the purpose of life is, I mean, the very purpose of life is to be that fullness of life that God has given to you. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. God has given you a job. You get a pension. You have your wife together. Live as much as you want. I mean, what exactly is your challenge? No, we don't want to live. That's it. I've asked the president to give me mercy killing euthanasia, and I want to die. I mean, it was very difficult. We just prayed for him, and we came. And we don't know about the present status. I just looked up to the internet to see what is the situation. My point is, do we have that kind of a liberty to enter into this living will, saying that at the end of life, I don't want any, to be entered into ICU and things like that. Give me an end. The moment you feel that life support is required, I don't want any support. I want to end my life. That kind of a thing is available in the living will. Is what I just wanted to please explain a little bit on that.
Yes. So, Smriti, you want to say anything, or should I? Okay. So I think I made that very clear. I think in the sense that it's our responsibility to put this down. Okay. If you don't put it down, then literally, I mean, that couple, they were actually asking for a commando team from the president to evacuate them to heaven straight off, which is not okay. That's not possible, and no government anywhere in the world is going to do that. So it's up to us to take charge of this kind of decision making and to actually start looking ahead. You will realize, and perhaps Smriti will come in on this. The point is that once you do this, once these decisions are made, once you've sorted this out, life actually becomes simpler. Smriti?
Yeah, thank you. As always, this is a very it's a very tricky territory also. The fact that these elderly people would rather have their lives ended than live under the conditions and circumstances. You said something, Murli, about them being lonely. And to me, that is the crux of the problem. In India, we haven't, to quote Dr. Raj, we haven't earned the right to talk about euthanasia when we haven't yet put in place adequate systems for addressing the existing suffering. Why does somebody want their lives to end? Because they're suffering in different ways, right? Emotionally and all of that. I wonder what would happen if the community was mobilized to support these elderly people a little bit better. And I wonder if, in a city like Bombay, could more people not have been engaged? So part of the palliative care work we do is community engagement for the support of elderly people living alone, not just for people with advanced terminal illnesses and so on. That's one thing. The second thing is that I think, Roop, we need to also spend a little bit of time talking about I know I oversimplified. It's not as simple as saying address the suffering, the euthanasia request will. It's not that simple. It's not that linear or binary. There are several components to it, of course. So please don't take me literally when I say that if you address suffering, the euthanasia request will come down. But it's a very slippery slope in autonomy when we open up this debate. People, tend to take a side saying, "Oh, self-determination should be everybody's right." It's not that simple. It's a very nuanced topic. So, Roop, I'm wondering if I know I keep
I'll
bringing
address
you
that.
back to this point. Yes, please. Thanks.
Okay. So if I look at this in a socio-political perspective, remember that the Netherlands has in the Netherlands you have the right to end your own life under medical conditions. A doctor will come in and they'll give you an injection. In some countries, especially in Switzerland and parts of the US, it has to be done by you yourself. Meaning the doctor will set up the injection, but the patient has to push or the patient has to swallow it. It's only in the Netherlands where the doctor will actually do it for you. And to have that happen, remember, it takes a whole system of jurisprudence that has that much confidence in making sure that it will not be misused. Now, you have European friends. They will stop at a red light at 12 in the midnight on a deserted road. Will Indians ever do that? No. So it is a question of respect for a system of law. That's one. Then it is also a way of understanding how death is and what happens. If you look at where we are, if we do all this, what I am suggesting, what we are talking about, and if India as a whole kind of begins this conversation, we actually need this to proceed for, well, how long will it take us? It will take us, I think, at least 2 decades more to get to the point where we are at the stage of the Netherlands. It is not going to happen overnight. At least let us start off with the living will. If we get this started, if we make this a broad, a force that politicians recognize, that politicians say, oh, yes, I want to put this law through my legislative assembly because people will recognize that I did this. No, at this moment, politicians are not interested because their voters are not interested. So until all these things happen, we are not going to get there. To say that this is like not even putting the cart before the horse, it's way more different than that. It is completely a different league of. We have to do all these things first before we get to the stage of euthanasia. A long, long way away. Sorry, a long answer to a short question.
Thank you. The question was long too.
Yeah, so let me look
Thank
at.
you.
I'm just going through the chat box also. And in the chat box, somebody spoke about DNR status. Okay. Now, DNR is do not resuscitate. Okay. I spoke about cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now, cardiopulmonary resuscitation is when when the heart stops. Now, if you look at it, if somebody's heart stops, if this is a young, healthy person, then when you intervene, you do whatever you're rescuing. But if somebody is dying and you do that procedure of CPR, which is actually a fairly painful process, you're actually torturing. Now, how do we recognize one from the other? That happens only when wishes are made clear, when doctors know what is about to happen, and at some point, rather than doing all of that, they say namaskar. So, is that possible in India? Yes, that has been made valid by the Supreme Court of India, and the Indian Council of Medical Research actually put out a proper document on it, which I was part of. And that document actually now, frankly, if somebody performs CPR against the wishes of an individual, if that is clearly stated, I suggest to you that you can sue the doctor. Across the
Thank you.
world, this is called wrongful life. In the US, it is one of the bigger causes of litigation, wrongful life. That somebody said, I want to go peacefully, and they were yanked back. Right? So DNR is legally valid, and if at all, if somebody is in hospital and the doctors ask for your signature for that, please understand that this is something that can and should be done. If it is, of course, if it is medically valid. Anything?
I'm
Because then I'll go through the rest of the chat one by one. Anybody? Sorry, who was that?
Sir Avatar here, sir.
Bolo.
Actually, I was wondering this only in lot of hospitals and all, because nobody is aware of do not resuscitate is whether it is legally applicable or not. Thank you for clearing that, sir. Thanks a lot.
So again, if you check, I think Smriti will probably, it must be up on Pallium India website. If not, we can put up the link to that article, because that's freely available.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, we've just shared it, and there's an end of life resource link which has been shared that has the ICMR document as well.
Right. So the next is donate organs, full body at the end of life. Now, donating the body for medical research, that's perfectly valid, and that is something that you need to put down and make sure that your family follows it. Donating organs, there are medical restrictions, in the sense that generally beyond the age of somewhere beyond 60 and definitely beyond the age of 70, there'll be major restrictions on organ donation, except the eyes and cornea, which is acceptable. So now, if you're looking at donating organs, this really applies to younger individuals who have sudden deaths, and where the person has so much brain damage that life is not worth living. Now, if you understand, in some situations, the person will be brain dead, which means the brain is gone. And that is something that doctors can decide. But there is a greater number of people who are not brain dead, but are not wholly alive also. And these are the states that we call the persistent vegetative state. Now, the problem is, in India today, we cannot take organs from somebody who is not in that strict condition of brain death. So abroad, this procedure is called donation after cardiac death. Now, this is an individual who has massive brain injury, is on the ventilator, and it is expected that the person will not survive, or if it survives, will be completely in bed and so on. And that person has written in advance, or the family has made a decision that at this stage, we want to remove the ventilator. Now, because we have to follow a strict ethical rule, which is called the dead donor principle, which means that the individual from whom you take organs has to be certified dead. So what is done abroad is that individual, the patient, is taken to the operation theater, and the ventilator is removed in the operation theater with everything being prepared. When you do this procedure, after some time, the heart stops. After the heart stops, and this requires laws to be passed. I mean, this has to be set very clearly. After 3 minutes, 5 minutes, after the heart has stopped, then it is accepted that that individual has passed on, and then the what we call the organ harvest team, because it's all being done in the OT, comes in immediately. And there's a beautiful essay written in the Lancet. Again, I think it is available free. It's called the Wackley essay. What, 2 years ago, it was written by an NRI doctor in the US. She writes of attending one such donation. It's, you read it, you'll have tears in your eyes at the end of it. So if anybody wants, I'll see. I should have a copy on my laptop. Right. So that is donation after cardiac death. So coming back to the point, this whole process of donation after cardiac death will happen only if the living will becomes well popularized enough for younger people also to be filling it up. So if somebody is very sure about what kind of life they would want, if for instance they were to have severe brain damage, what they would not want, then the living will, with a mention of organ donation and so on, is what is required. Now, obviously, the procedures, the laws for that are still not in place. I'm part of the group that is working on setting that up, but from here to actually making it happen, I think is some years away.
Roop, there are a couple of questions in the chat box about is there a cutoff age for organ donation?
Yeah, I answered that. I think 70.
Yeah, and
typically.
Okay, and one more about I'm not sure if you were able to see that, about advanced directives can be revoked orally, just to reconfirm that.
Yeah, so that actually is a bit of a problem at some time. In sometimes it is, because you know what happens is towards the end of life, people are quite confused, and there have been instances in the West where somebody has written out a proper advanced care plan, and in the end, because they are awake and they seem to be able to speak, and the doctor is by law supposed to ask the patient, this was your living will, do you still want to follow it? And the patient has said no, take it away, and then the living will gets revoked instantly. So that is not a very common issue, but yeah, but you have the right, even if you're confused and say nahi abhi nahi chahiye, yeah, you can do that.
That brings us to another important I was saying that it brings us to another important issue, Roop, about people living with dementia. And if we can just touch upon that for a moment, because there's a lot of debate and about people with dementia and their advanced directives, and a person who's already on the trajectory of dementia, if they decide to do it and the advanced care planning, how does that work? So the controversy that came up just recently as well, I think you know what I'm talking about. I think in Belgium they came up with a law. So can you just touch, Netherlands, sorry, if you could just talk about that for a few minutes.
Okay. Also, if I may add about the, sorry to interrupt, about people who are under psychiatric care, long-term psychiatric care for 30 years or 40 years, it's not necessary that they die early. So people who've been diagnosed with psychiatric problems like schizophrenia or bipolar, and they've been treated for 30 or 40 years. Now, what kind of advanced care planning can be done for them, and who does it? I mean, how is it even possible?
Yes. So remember that when you do this, the living will, one of the reasons for having witnesses and some amount of safeguards is to make sure that the person is of sound mind at the time that it's done. So when you are signing it, you are of course signing it that you are of sound mind. It is understood that if somebody is able to follow this somewhat complex document, they should be of sound mind. But people who have begun to have dementia, there is a stage in dementia where they start to lose the ability to figure out what's happening and to project forward. But in the beginning of dementia, they can actually understand all of this. And it's important that when this document is made in somebody who's dementia, you actually have somebody certifying it, a doctor Could be a neurologist or psychiatrist certifying it. Now, when you speak of people with schizophrenia or with psychiatric disorders, again, some of them will probably have dementia towards their later years. And again, the same rules will apply. Some worry about whether this overlaps with suicide. I think, no, not really, because, well, if somebody is suicidal, they're not going to do this whole long-winded thing of a living will. It doesn't make sense. So we leave that aside. Smriti, you want to comment on that? I mean, about capacity determination in people with psychiatric illnesses?
No, I think I'm not actually. That's an area that I would really like to learn more about myself. But I do understand that not just people with say severe psychiatric conditions, but even people with cognitive deficits and things like that. I mean, there are a lot of gray areas there, aren't there, Roop? I mean,
it is complex. So part of the whole
yeah,
business
it is very complex.
The part of this whole business is, let's leave the complex situations aside.
Okay.
90% of us will have a simple situation. So let's cover the simple situations first.
Yes. That brings me round back to what you've told us today. Excellent information, really needed. Thank you so much. You've obviously put in a lot of time and effort into researching this so much. And I've heard you in so many forums, and I really respect the kind of effort you do. So my question to you, Dr. Roop, today is, when we are talking about we as a group are learning how to be people who can advocate palliative care and also be people who can provide that kind of support to those around us. My question is, when we talk about such advanced topics, as if I may call it, advanced care planning and end of life situations and all that, where in a country like India, where even palliative care is something, when I start talking about it, I'm laughed off my chair. People just laugh off their chairs. I mean, what are you talking about? It's so difficult to even, and for me as a caregiver to 6 elder siblings, I'm the youngest, and these 6 elder siblings are, I mean, they've all made me the nominee, thinking that I'm the youngest, so I'm going to outlast them, which is no one can guarantee that. But the problem is that, are we trying to put the cart before the horse when we talk about advanced care planning and all that, when even a simple thing like, palliative care is something that I'm not able to even broach the subject with so many people, including my own family.
This one is for you. The conversation project.
Thank you, Roop. Yes. So Rupert touched upon the conversation project. We've been in touch with them. The website link has been shared. It's actually a great resource to. It actually helps you have a conversation with your family and with people in your immediate social circles. However, it is geared to a Western sort of mindset. So we are partnering with them this year to contextualize it to the Indian setting. Because they're the proprietors of the whole conversation project thing. They haven't actually worked in an LMIC, in a low and middle income country. So we'll have to work closely with them in order to bring in the cultural sensitivities into it. Having said that, Sam, I mean, I've posted this somewhere. I've been called the Grim Reaper because I talk about palliative care so much. And but over time, I realize it's also how we message it. And I find that, in Trivandrum, 2 years ago, 24th August is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's death anniversary. And we did globally, there's this thing called Let's Have Dinner and Talk About Death. There's this event that happens across the world. So we didn't do that. We did tea on the beach, and like 1,500 people showed up, all wanting to know more about death and dying and things like that. So yes, it is a difficult topic to broach in some settings, but I find that more and more people, especially with the pandemic, more and more people are sort of they have no choice but to confront their mortality. So it is a matter of choosing the right moment, choosing the right time, choosing the right message, perhaps, and it's a long uphill battle. But see, I mean, the more I'm sure more of you are now. Sorry, I just got disconnected. More of you here are probably feeling a little bit more equipped to have these conversations. So it's really about having that little ripple effect in our own little ponds and hoping they all connect. So very vague, ambiguous answer, but that's where we are right now.
I don't blame you for that. The topic is so, it sounds like it's very ambiguous and vague to a lot of people whom we talk about it, including us when we started learning from you all. It used to be other thing, but like you rightly said, yes, the movement is important. Sadly, the movement in India seems to be right on us, and if we don't do it now, it seems like a huge task. But yeah, we start somewhere. And I always remember one thing Dr. Roop always, I think in a couple of other webinars, he mentioned this story of the starfish, which, you know, a boy keeps throwing back into the sea. Yes, we all do it. You're thinking, okay, one starfish, if it is saved at the end of it, well, it's worth it. And 40 of us here, so 40 starfish are going to be saved. Good enough to start with. Let's take it from there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You said the right closing lines for this.
There you go. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Sam, just wanted to add one thing. You know who we have found to be a very receptive group are the young people. Maybe there's a sense of, you know, invincibility that they have, so they're okay to talk about these things. I don't know, but that's the group that we also really need to start talking to. And these conversations, I mean, I joined this particular session a little late. I'm sorry about that. But the conversations need to begin when we're healthy, not when we're already sick. I mean, of course, it's relevant then. But suppose we have a easy, lighthearted conversation with our families and try and, you know, bring this in, then it might be a little bit easier. Ashwin, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, just on that, I think my personal experience, I'm in my family known to be the one to broach all the uncomfortable subjects, especially, I mean, on both sides of my mom and dad, they don't like talking about anything, even though we actually have experienced, I mean, dementia, cancer amongst my grandparents. But before I used to do it without much knowledge because I'm a lawyer by education, and in law school, when they used to talk about just the will itself, it's something that really interested me. And I would go ask my grandmother, I said, you know, because we used to make fun of her that she's very wealthy and all. So she's like, have you written a will? And she's just like, no, you just want to know, you just want my wealth and that's all. So I'm not going to do this. But I always knew that underlying, she never wanted to talk about it because she didn't want to like broach the subject of her, what will happen after she dies and all of those things. But now I feel because of the time that I've spent here and because of this better knowledge that I have, that now when I go back and talk to them, they also understood now that, okay, I'm coming from a place of knowledge and I'm not just talking just, you know, they've started to respect a little bit of what I'm saying. And I think because like my grandmother, I have one grandparent who is alive now. She recently said, she's like, you know, now I want to take you more seriously because, you know, I feel that it's time for the younger generation to like start telling us what to do. And because she's realized now after the pandemic and all that, you know, there's so much that she was very proud of being independent, but at the same time didn't want to accept help when she definitely did need it. And now she sort of understood that, you know, when it's necessary, it'll only help her further and those things. So I think there is a change that is coming in the attitude that my family takes towards a conversation like this. And and like Shruti said, I think people that my age need to be the ones to start that conversation maybe. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Right. Somebody raised their hands. Yeah, Ashwin did. Yes, Mr. Murli. I think that was earlier. So, right. Are we done, Smriti?
One
I
quick
think Mr.
question.
Murli does have something to say. Yes.
Yeah, one quick question. This is bothering me a lot. So I do not know whether this is the right question to ask this for this subject on advanced directives, but then still I ask Smriti can as well rope in and answer this question. I'm connected with an NGO here and there are more than 300 people. And I have tried to spend time with them. All of them are destitutes. Majority of them are men, and sit and talk to them. Where are they from? Which place do they belong? Who's their mother and father? And no clue, absolutely no clue. I don't know, police complaint has been made and all sorts of efforts have been made, but we are not able to reconnect those people, 300 plus people. Now, is there any way in the medical sciences or through the DNA? I was told in Switzerland, they have a DNA group. They'll try to match with the DNA, which is lost person, and with the DNA of the family, and they can reconnect. In India, it's near to impossibility. I know that. What is the way out? Do you have any way out to reconnect those people?
So in Mumbai, so there are, from what you are saying, these are probably two categories of people. The younger ones are probably likely to be chronic schizophrenics, people who have major issues which are psychiatric and probably amenable to some amount of treatment. The older ones may well be also suffering from dementia, in which case they probably lost their memories, and then it is difficult. So for the schizophrenic group, you should connect with this. There's this very strong NGO working out of Mumbai who pick up schizophrenics on the roadside, take them back to their hospital, treat them. They raise funds. I've donated to. They raise funds for that, treat them, then find out where they came from, and then the social worker, and they have a whole paraphernalia of social workers and all that, and they have lots of remarkable success stories.
Okay, can you please?
They are based. You have my email. Just send me the mail.
I'll send
and
a mail.
I'll connect you. Yeah,
fine. Thank you.
I'll connect you to them because they are
Thank you.
A group of people who are perpetually looking for help.
Thank you,
and
sir.
I'm sure you can extend them to Kerala. So I'm sure they'll be happy.
Thank you, sir.
Right.
Thank you very much.
I think we're over time. So
this session was so very touching, so very, very useful. I feel you should be talking to us for more number of hours on this subject.
No, I love my own voice, but I think I have to stop.
That's what everyone says to Dr. Roop every time he speaks on this particular topic or anything connected with palliative care. Everywhere they don't want him to stop, but I think we should let him go because he's got many more people waiting to speak to him.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roop. Thank you so much. As always, such a valuable session. And thank you, everybody else. Please write in with any additional questions that you might have. Over the next week, we will try and get you the answers that you want. Also, the resource link that Shreya and Gina have shared will be useful in your research as well. Happy to assist in any further way. So have a great weekend, everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
God bless you. God bless you. Thank you.
Bye.
Very kind of you, Dr. Roop and Smriti and Shreya and the rest of you. Thank you.
So see you all next week for Considerations at the End of Life by Dr. Raj. So I think we'll be completing the circle about talking about end of life. Thank you so much and see you all next week. And please fill in the feedback form. Thank you.
Sarima, please wait for a few minutes. We will share the feedback form now.
Okay.
It's done.
Yes, you can. I'll share it on the WhatsApp group also.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Nice.